Welcome everyone. My name is Avril Torrance. I am here at the Medicine Hat Public Library for a filming of Between the Lines. I am a former instructor at Medicine Hat College. I am currently a board member at the Medicine Hat Public Library, and it is indeed my honor and privilege to be at this library today to welcome home Mark Sakamoto, recent winner of CBC Canada Reads, together with his father Stan Sakamoto, and to be here in particular in the library with the both of them as we read between the lines of Mark's exceptionally eye-opening book, Forgiveness, A Gift from My Grandparents. So Mark, I've had an opportunity to read a little bit about you and ferret out some more information from people who have known you here in this community. Certainly it's interesting to me that you have been a former president of the Medicine Hat College Students Association, and that you went on to a career in law and have enjoyed a rich and varied career that is in live music and in a number of other things, including working as a senior political advisor to one of Canada's national party leaders, entrepreneur just like his father, and as well then sitting on boards of the Ontario Media Development Corporation, but living now in Toronto. So indeed, welcome home, Mark.
Thank you very much.
For viewers who haven't had an opportunity yet to read Forgiveness, I'm wondering if you can just give them a very brief summary from your perspective of your remarkable book.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for your time, and thanks to Shaw TV for hosting, and the Medicine Hat Library for setting this all up. Forgiveness is at its core chronicling the two sides of my family during the Second World War. So on the West Coast, like all 21,000 Japanese Canadian citizens, during the war, forces really rallied. There was a lot of racism in British Columbia, and those forces used the war as really sort of a cover to drive Japanese Canadians out of Vancouver, where they were living a very rich, culturally diverse life deep in the tapestry of British Columbia, and they were all uprooted. My dad's mom and dad went from a very wonderful life to living in a chicken coop outside of Coaldale. And so that was really horrific. On the other side of the country, my grandpa McLean, my mom's dad, like most boys his age, wanted to go fight in Europe, lied about his age, but he was sent to Hong Kong. And Hong Kong fell soon after Pearl Harbor, and he spent the entire war as a Japanese POW, which was really a horrific experience. The depravity of those years, what he endured, are shocking, even after I've really spent a lot of time with it. That was the premise going in. Spending that much time with a theme like forgiveness, you really can't have it not wash across your own personal shores. So the book took a very much a more personal turn than I thought. My dad's first wife and my mom passed away of alcoholism, and so that really came to the surface. And so the book took a bit of a different turn, one which I had to talk to my dad about as we went through, and because it wasn't just a love letter to my grandparents anymore, it was very much our life. And
absolutely.
So fortunately he was cool with it.
Yeah, and it is such a universal sort of book in so many regards, or at least it has so many touchstones. And since it was published in 2014, it has obviously enjoyed great success, and now, most recently, including winning CBC Canada Reads. And the recent announcement that it will become a 4-part miniseries, also currently in development, I understand, from the CBC and Don Carmody Television. So I'm just wondering at this juncture then if you can tell us a little bit about the experience of your having had your book in this national spotlight.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, the book was published in 2014, so it's not a new book. You know, it was published, and I did this all of this in 2014. It was really well received, and then sort of life went on. And so to get sort of a lightning bolt out of the blue with Canada Reads deciding that it was going to be shortlisted was really incredible on a number of levels. But I think the most interesting level, I think, is that in 2014 a lot of the themes that Forgiveness touched on were retrospective. They were a long time ago. They felt like a long time ago. State-sanctioned racist policies and rising ugly nationalism and themes of that nature. And I remember when I was interviewing my grandma Sakamoto just down the street, across the river down the street, about 5 blocks, I asked her, why am I'm hearing a lot about your story just for the first time? Why haven't you talked about this more? And she looked me cold in the eyes and she said, because hate can come back. And I chuckled at that. I didn't laugh at my grandma, but I chuckled at the thought of the themes that we were discussing coming back in a prescient manner. And obviously, lo and behold, in 2018, you can't pick up the Globe and Mail or the Medicine Hat News or the BBC without, having some resurgence of these kinds of themes. So I think Forgiveness has really turned into a bit of a warning alarm as opposed to a retrospective. It's much more current today than it was even when it was published, I think.
Yeah, indeed. And the Canada Reads theme of a book that opens your eyes certainly, I think, resonates there with what you were saying. That spotlight that you're under at the moment has now, I'm going to shift to you, Stan, obviously started to shine its light on you as well, so much so that we have this unique opportunity here in the Medicine Hat Public Library to have you both together for this interview.
Appreciate being here.
Oh, thank you. And because for viewers here from this area, Forgiveness resonates so deeply for our community readers, doesn't it? And with both of you having grown up here, and for you, Mark, with your mother and the late memories that you have made with her in this community. But you have moved on to Toronto, and Stan, you remain here as a successful entrepreneur and very well respected in this community. So I would like to use this opportunity to hear from Stan and about his experience so we can read a bit between the lines with him for a few minutes. You had mentioned, Mark, that of the Japanese internment during the Second World War, and your parents, Stan, were forced to move to the Coaldale area. Were the Kootenays, though, as they were for many Japanese families or Japanese-Canadian families, ever an option for your parents that you know of?
They chose to keep their family intact,
Okay.
and the option was to come to the prairies and primarily work on the sugar beet fields that labor was necessary. And in order to keep the family together, that's what they chose to do, is to move to southern Alberta.
Whereas having been interred in the Kootenays wouldn't have allowed that option for family togetherness in the same way?
Well, I think it was all an unknown for all the families where to go.
Right.
But in retrospect, I'm glad they chose the prairies, even though life was harsh. I did tour some of the internment camps in the Kootenays, and like the prairies, there was an influx of Japanese Canadians, and life was pretty harsh there too.
Yes.
These ghost camps were resurrected, and then these small shacks were built. 2 families were housed in these areas in the Kootenays. But on the prairies, they became like indentured laborers, and they kept their family together, and they could earn a small amount of money.
And do you find that your parents were fairly open with you and your siblings around what had happened to them in the past?
They would occasionally talk about it, but they never went into really fine detail about their hardships. They just encouraged us as children to make our way in the Medicine Hat area growing up, and enabling us to make a decent living here. And you know, their lesson for us was to work hard, be honest, and keep your shoes shined.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm just wondering, certainly Mark speaks of this in the book itself, but can you explain from your perspective how you found that your parents and siblings decided to move here to Medicine Hat?
It was a friend of my father's, Ted Nishimoto. They went to high school together, and Ted was farming in the Seven Persons area with a little market garden, and suggested that my father and the family move to Medicine Hat because the SMRID was providing irrigation into this area, and he thought it would be a great place to grow vegetables because there was so much sunlight, and there was irrigation here, and there was land available to rent. So that's what they did, and they rented a small plot of land near where the current sewage treatment plant is, and they called it Golden Valley at that time, and started market gardening and selling produce at the market square, and also through Scott National, one of the wholesale companies in Medicine Hat at that time.
And so they must have found this particular community relatively welcoming, but some people might find it somewhat strange that they chose to stay living here in southern Alberta and not choose perhaps to return to the Vancouver area and instead just stay in a place where they were essentially forced to live.
Yeah, I think it was a choice, but also economics too.
Right.
At that time. You know, they're raising a family and eking out a living, and the only time that they did go back to Vancouver was through family gatherings, either funerals or weddings. But they started putting roots down in Medicine Hat and continued to work here. Both Mom and Dad also worked at Dominion Glass, which was out in Redcliffe, and continued farming. So raising children, they set roots down here, which I really appreciate as a son growing up, because it was a great place to grow up here and still live and raise my children here, Avril.
Yeah, and I wonder if any of the assets that they had previously owned were ever returned to them.
No, they was all dispersed. And there was a very small token amount of funds returned to them, even after the administration took part of that funds to process the disposal of properties.
And certainly some of the more specific details of that certain lack of return are quite evident in Mark's book, without a doubt. Your family, it's one of only a handful of Japanese Canadian families living in Medicine Hat, and certainly was at that time. But do you happen to know what happened to some of those other families, those Japanese Canadian families, who were forced to move to the Coaldale area?
You know, most of the Japanese Canadians that I'm familiar with naturally are the people that moved to Medicine Hat at that time, and primarily all of them went into market gardening, you know, in the late 40s and 50s and 60s. And currently all of those families have now terminated market gardening and moved into other areas of their livelihoods.
Yeah, and so you, Stan, were born here in Medicine Hat, were you not?
Yes, I'm thankful about that.
Yeah, and your brother and sister were born earlier while the war was still on.
Yes.
Did they ever speak to you about their memories of the 1940s and early 50s, either in the anywhere in southern Alberta or here in Medicine Hat?
Yeah, I think, you know, growing up, they were in the fields with my parents because they were working all the time in the market garden. So I recall a couple of photos, you know, of Gloria and Gary. They're playing in the fields with their toys while the parents are out laboring in the fields. And some of the other stories that Ron would tell me about was
This is your older brother, Ron.
Yeah, he's 7 years older than I am. So at that time, there was a little bit of more. I don't want to say hostility, but he was bullied, so he had to fight back, and particularly in elementary school, to not prove himself, but to overcome the racism that he incurred.
And did you yourself, going to school here in Medicine Hat and continuing to live here in Medicine Hat, ever feel that racism touched you directly in your life?
Avril, I have to admit, I feel very fortunate growing up here, because it never came to fruition. I was just a normal kid growing up in Medicine Hat, having family, friends, and doing whatever we do as Canadians, playing baseball and hockey, and just enjoying growing up here. As I was saying, I grew up right across the river here in the shadows of St. Patrick's Church, and it was a wonderful place. And so I didn't experience any blatant racism.
Well, and that didn't necessarily even come to any kind of point when you decided that Ralph McLean's daughter Diane was going to be a partner for you. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you met her and why she was someone you thought you could establish a life with.
Thanks, April. One of my good friends is Ken Appleton and Darlene D. And they went to Medicine Hat High School, and I went to Crescent Heights, so we knew each other. And so there was that circle of friends. And then at a McCoy High School dance, Darlene's cousin, Diane, came down from Calgary, and it was just, let's go to the dance, and all of a sudden I saw Darlene's cousin, and she was a new girl in town, and I thought, well, I'll go have a dance with this new person in town. And so then as time moved along, I went to SAIT, to Southern Alberta Institute of Technology, and so when I was in Calgary, I called her. I was new in town, so I thought I would see if she wanted to go out on a date. So that was the beginning of that relationship back in the 60s.
Yeah, and I guess from certain viewers' perspectives, it might seem, it certainly would seem strange perhaps and unique. I wonder if there had been some pressure from within your family, or maybe your Japanese Canadian friends and other families, for you to seek out a partner within the Japanese Canadian community.
Yeah, it was never approached from that perspective. It was relationships. To be candid, there were no other Japanese Canadian girls of my age to date, Avril. And I never thought about it in those terms, because I did go out on some other dates with high school friends.
Right.
And it was just normal for me to have friends that we just enjoyed each other's company, no matter who they were.
And I think it's true to say also statistically that there's a lot of interconnection among Japanese Canadians and non-Japanese descent persons in Canada, is there not?
Yeah, there's a very high percentage of intermarriage that way. And I think it's just an openness that we have. If you find love, it doesn't matter where it comes from. It's just a part of life. You just find it where it blossoms. And in my case, I'm married to Susan, and we knew each other in grade 9 at Crescent Heights High School. So
right, and so that's your current partner with yes. And then once you started dating Diane McLean and Ralph, coming from his Scottish Canadian background, did you have any conversations with him prior to the dinner party that Mark captures very effectively in his book, that sort of, that he revealed some more of his experiences to you directly?
Yeah, when I would go over to Ralph and Phyllis's house, sometimes I would drop downstairs and we'd play ping pong. And on the wall he had some of his medals and also a banner of being a veteran of the Hong Kong Veterans Association. And we would touch on it, but he didn't really divulge any details, of his horrific time as a Canadian soldier fighting in Hong Kong.
Right, and you're a young man interested in his daughter.
Well, we were dating.
Yeah. It's not necessarily likely to lead to a lot of conversations around his
Right.
Yeah, that's a buzzkill.
past. Indeed. So I'm just wondering now if we can turn it back to Mark and the writing of the book for a bit. You have spoken elsewhere and with the CBC about how your book, Forgiveness, came about, starting with an essay. But can you recount the highlights of that process for our local audience?
Sure. Like everything in this book, it was really a bolt of lightning. I had gone to Dalhousie Law School and had befriended a guy by the name of Aaron O'Toole. He's a conservative. At the time, he was a conservative cabinet minister. He went into politics, and he went on to be the Veterans Affairs Minister, actually. But he's a good friend of mine. And I was in Kuwait City, of all places, on a business trip, and I received an email because my friend Aaron O'Toole, who knew about my family history, given our chats at law school, had, unbeknownst to me, wrote John Stackhouse, who ran the Globe and Mail at the time, and said, our mutual friend Mark has this crazy family story, you should let him write an essay about it. And so John replied to Aaron, but CC'd me. And so on the flight from Kuwait City to Toronto, which is one heck of a long flight, I wrote an essay. And John published it on Boxing Day. Actually, I was in Medicine Hat. So Jade and I were home celebrating Christmas, and I woke up on Boxing Day to a whole flood of emails, and one of which was a well-known literary agent in Toronto saying, when you home, HarperCollins wants to come and have you come in. And so when I walked into HarperCollins about a week later, I thought I was meeting like one person, but there were 15 people in the room. And I remember walking up the stairs to my house, and Jade, who had just had a baby, and I said, I think I'm going to write a book. And she was taken aback, is what I'm going to say. She was taken aback.
Because she was about to lose
Yeah.
her husband for some time.
Sometime.
It's a very, involving and solitary experience.
It's all consuming, and it's we didn't know when I jumped into the deep end just what it meant really to write a book. I'd never really thought about it in any meaningful way. And my company was growing quite rapidly, so I couldn't take time away from that either. I couldn't just take a leave of absence, nor did I want to. So it was just a lot of early mornings and late nights and weekends, and Jade was really a single mom for about 20 months. Yeah, she really carried the family torch.
And you can obviously then it became, interviews with your grandparents and speaking to your father and so on. Did it ever feel that at some point maybe it was also, say, your brother Daniel's story to write and not yours, or?
Yeah, I was very mindful of that, especially so when I started writing, I was researching a lot about the 1920s and 30s and 40s, but when I was writing a lot about the 1980s. I was writing about my mom. Mm-hmm. And so I remember a couple months into the contract, I called my editor and I said, "Can we meet?" And we met in downtown Toronto, and I said, I'm writing something very different than what we discussed, and it has nothing to do with the actual contract. And he said, well, he's a brilliant editor, Jim Gifford, his name, is just a wonderful human being, and he said, just get that story, commit it, be in communion with it, really go deep on it. Maybe it'll be in the book, maybe it won't, maybe it'll be another book, maybe it'll just be for your family and for yourself, but get it out. And so when I started to write about, as I said in the intro, when I really started to commit to paper my brother's life, details of his life, my father's life, details of his life, in that really vulnerable state, then I became very aware of the gravity of the story. It wasn't just my story, although I was determined to have it was my voice, I was writing it,
Right.
and it was my story, but I didn't want anybody to feel like they were, unintended consequences of me telling the story, so I wanted to be cognizant of that. Mm-hmm. And they were both great, they were wonderful.
Yeah,
a
well,
lot of
it's
faith in.
a remarkably public and personal book at the very same time. And I know that you have remarked elsewhere as well on influences, one of them, understandably, Michael Ignatieff. And he said, just dig deeply, was his remarks to you. But is there ever that place at which you start digging so deeply you think, I'm not sure I want to go be further than this? And what do you decide that? I'm not asking you to
Yeah.
reveal all the dirt
No,
of
no.
that digging process, but how do you make that decision of what to put in and what to leave out? That's a writer's dilemma.
Well, I think that you hit the nail on the head. I think that when you feel, oh, I don't feel comfortable about how deep I'm going, I think that's exactly when you need to go deeper.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I think that in telling, I was telling a story about people that mean the most to me in life, and so I was acutely aware that I was holding people that I loved deeply in my hands, quite literally in my hands, and typing hands. Mm-hmm. But you have to, I do believe that you have to love people honestly. Quirks, warts, good and bad, and you have to love your country honestly. So I had no dispute with, an internal dispute with talking about Ralph and Mitsue and Stan and Daniel and Diane, especially Diane, in as truthful a way as possible. Because I love them, and I think if you're truthful about it, then you're going to love them too. People are going to come to love them too. But I wasn't, I didn't, I tried not to varnish any edges. And myself too. That was sort of hard, where you start to think about why I made decisions. I could have gone to any law school in the country. I could have gone to Calgary. I could have gone to Edmonton, Vancouver. Mm-hmm. Why did I choose, when my mom was at her, most desperate hour, why did I choose to go to the furthest law school I could in Canada, right? I mean, you explore what that says, why you did that, and, to commit that to paper, it's not very comfortable, personally even. So I tried what's good for the goose was good for the gander, and I tried to sort of throw it all out there, and while I was writing, I did think, I can edit later, and I never really did go back and self-edit anything. I just tried to be as authentic to the story as I possibly could.
And there, certainly, it's a painful personal book in many regards. It's painful for Canadians to recognize that they all inherit those racist policies that established the lives of your grandparents and also put so many young men at risk, like Ralph McLean. And one of the persons whom you also identify as an influence on you is Joy Kogawa. Yeah. And her novel Obasan. I'm wondering how much influence that novel had on you as you wrote your own book.
Oftentimes when somebody that looks like you does something, you hear people say, I really, like Obama was a great example of, right, a generation of black men saying, wow, and women, wow, that's really something, I can do that too. And so I remember, I do remember Obasan being a big part of our life, in the sense that our story was being told. Right. And not too long after Brian Mulrooney in '88, offered redress and stood up as the holder of the highest office to say, you know, what happened to you was wrong, and you are every bit as Canadian as your neighbor, and that should not have happened. So that was a really big deal in our life, and because you're right, trauma can be passed down, both from a personal perspective and at a more macro level. So I think, you know, I think people sort of will rib Prime Minister Trudeau for apologizing a lot, but I think that, you know, those kinds of apologies are very important to the people that they're that are receiving that state apology, and because trauma can be passed down, and we see that. I mean, goodness gracious, do we see that in the Indigenous community? I mean, there's just, you know, generation after generation of trauma being passed down, and you can get into a cycle where it is bloody hell hard to overcome that. Right. And so I'm a big fan of that. And to end on a little softer note with Joy, she's actually been engaged in as a creative consultant in writing the script, and so
and congratulations
to be
there
able
too.
to, yeah, thank you, to be able to spend time with Joy. You know, I go to her house, her condo, and she's bi-coastal, so I go to her condo in Toronto, and we go over the scripts, and we drink tea and ocha, and it's like I'm with my grandma in a way. It's just wonderful, and she is a genius artist. She is an author's author. She's wonderful.
Oh, and her subsequent book on the redress of the Japanese Canadians, with the word that I would botch as a non-Japanese speaker.
She's wonderful. She really is. She's
remarkable.
She's a force. She's a dynamo. And you know, and you did reference Ignatieff, who really was. He was a great mentor to me early on in writing this book. He's written 18 books or something like that. Some political nonfiction, some fiction. He wrote a nonfiction family. Scar Tissue was about his mother's descent into dementia. Very similar in terms of you know, some of the themes he was exploring around familial pain. And you know, he was very sweet. He had Jade and I over they had a place in France, and we went over, and he said, you know, listen, I'm not going to tell you about your story, but I'll tell you, you got to go deep. To your point about going deep, you got to really put the reader in this space, and there's just no shortcuts. You just got to keep your butt in that seat, and you know, and get to it.
Yeah, and and to move to the specifics of forgiveness itself. And to think about what forgiveness is. You've talked about it as not a transaction and so on, and not to pass those transgressions on to children. That forgiveness looks forward and not to the past. Yet, so many people have that expression, forgive and forget. And we wonder if, in some ways, though, forgiveness is not about forgetting at all.
Oh yeah, no, I hold that sentiment in contempt, actually. I think forgiveness has nothing to do with forgetting, and that's the last thing you want to do is forget. And it's very important not to forget, actually, because a big part of forgiveness, I think, is ensuring that what has happened to you and how those injurious years came about are not repeated, and because you never end up in the basement. I mean, you always take steps to the basement, you know. And in the Sakamoto's case and in Japanese Canadians' case, you know, the first step is, well, you're carded. Okay, you know, well, maybe you're, you know, and then you lose your radio, and then you have martial law, and then before you know it, you are in a dark, dirty basement, and you're literally in a chicken coop. And you didn't start there. You never start there. But with these kinds of actions, you know, hate always comes wrapped in the flag, and it's like the oldest trick in the book, you know, and it's always fake. Like, fake news is not new. It's always a lie. But if those forces can take one step, they'll take another. And if they can take a second step, they'll take a third. And you know, before you know it, you've lost your entire life, and it's a life that you never get back. Like, you know, Dad was being generous in terms of why they didn't move back. They didn't move back because they lost all of their damn things, and they had no money to get back.
And
The
nowhere to
war
go back
ended in
to.
1945, and their war was not with the Canadian government. Their war was with abject poverty.
Right.
They couldn't go anywhere. So they came here, they rented some farmland, you know? So they never got, now, fortunately, they did have forgiveness, and Dad lived a pretty darn wonderful life, and that was facilitated a pretty darn great life for me too. But, you know, what they had to go through was just incredibly horrific.
And I'm wondering if, as you were spending time with your grandparents on both sides, if they always were sharing their stories with you. Did they hold them back until perhaps you were more adult to really understand them? What was your experience like with your grandparents when you were a child?
Sure, yeah, they were great. They were all really wonderful grandparents. My Hideo, who we don't really talk about too much in this book, but my dad's dad, you know, he was a really hardworking man, and he wasn't the grandpa like my grandpa Ralph was the kind of grandpa that would, you know, he'd take you fishing, he'd take you golfing, he was that kind of grandpa, right? But Hideo wasn't, and Hideo was an incredibly bright man, but he was educated in Japan. And then when he was born in Canada, educated in Japan, came back and spent time, as most Japanese Canadian men spent time in lumber camps that were, you know, he lived a very Japanese life, and so his English was quite broken all of his life, and so that really kept a barrier between him and his family in many ways, I think is fair to say. And my grandma, we're in a house of books, and so one of the great things that my grandma did, and really where I think for the first time really understood the power of a book, is she got me a book. She went to Kohl's and ordered it, and it was a Kingfisher book of maps. Like, it wasn't a literature book because it was for Grandpa and I to talk about flags, talk about geography, because he was an amateur historian, but he was very well versed in sort of world facts. And so, you know, we would learn together, or he would teach me in very broken English, you know, the capital of Brazil is Brasilia, and Indonesia is the 4th largest population. All of these sorts of things. Like, this was the way that we would converse. This silly little flag book was the bridge upon which our relationship was built. And so, yeah, I remember just wonderful times as a child growing up with my grandparents. And then when it came time to write the book, I did drag them through really, really awful times in their life. I think they were ready to talk about it, though. They were both in their 90s, and, you know, they weren't sentimental about their stage in life. Like, you know, they had years, not, you know, months, not years necessarily, right? So they were very open.
And I think you remind all of us that life is fleeting, and if you have the opportunities to speak to your elders and have them tell their stories to you, you should take that opportunity when it arises, because they will soon be gone, and their stories sometimes go with them, and that's a real shame.
No question. You know, one of the things, before Gord Downey passed away, you know, I was at the concert in Kingston, and, you know, he said something really profound that I'm ashamed to say I never really thought about it, but he said, you know, wouldn't it be great if Canadians were, you know, really undertook to really envelop the Indigenous culture and vice versa, like what it could look like. And that is absolutely one of the things that Canadians from, you know, wherever really should look to, I think, our Indigenous brothers and sisters, and really come to understand that they as a culture do that on a regular basis, you know, like that's seeped in Indigenous culture, is really verbally getting the stories of their ancestors, and that it's passed down. And that's something that for me, it was the most sacred of nights to be talking to my grandparents, and I hope if anybody's out there watching that they do the same.
And did you know about the Japanese prisoner of war camps before you really sat down to listen to your maternal grandfather?
Oh yeah, sure I did.
That?
I mean, I loved history. I loved politics as a little kid, and so I would press my grandpa to talk about it. But so I knew the bones of the story. He didn't delve into the details, but I certainly knew what he experienced and what he went through, and had read several books about it.
And then with those horrific details, and I think for many readers of forgiveness in Canada, it's that perhaps more distant experience of the Japanese prisoner of war camp that opens their eyes so strongly to, I mean, again, you kind of knew it happened, but you didn't know in the precise detail that your grandfather McLean was prepared to offer to you. And I wonder if in hearing those details, that really helped to make you realize the incredible depth of his forgiveness.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Hong Kong was the worst by not by aggregate number, but by per capita. It was the worst military highest casualty rate in Canadian military history. 100% of the men, that 1,975 Canadians went onto that island, and 100% of them were casualties. And by casualties, you're either killed or you're captured. So not a single soul left that island unscathed. And of the 1975, 1,050 of them were killed, and and they were killed in such terrible ways. But the ones that survived would be, they'd be forgiven for feeling the unlucky ones, because what they went through in terms of all kinds of deprivation, starvation, lack of medicine, diphtheria, dysentery. It was nothing short of hell on earth. So you're right. I mean, the level of injury that he experienced, how he could go from that and in a few short years, really, to be the gracious gentleman that he is still today, is absolutely remarkable.
And I know that in the section of your book that's entitled Release, you allude to the Book of Mark and the statement on forgiveness, that when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive them so that your Father in heaven may forgive you your sins. And I just wonder if it is indeed Ralph McLean's Christian heritage that really got him through and helped him to forgive so much so to allow Stan and Diane to consider a life together.
Yeah.
Is it his Christianity that's at root there for you?
I think that's a big part of it for him. I think that I mean, he lived a pretty hard scrabble life growing up. His dad, as I said, was a very angry, bitter, violent man, but his mother was his ray of light, and she made sure that her children were right by her God. But when Grandpa, I think, went into the war, I think he'd call himself a Christian, but I don't think that he was as devout as when he came out. And he was telling, and I wrote about it in the book, but when the Americans started to win and the Japanese forces were really falling back, the bombers would drop big packages, barrels, on and around POW camps so that the POWs could start eating and receiving medical treatment. And the boys, they were just so starved, they would just attack the barrels and eat ferociously. But Ralph, while he did eat some, he grabbed the Bible. It's pretty remarkable. You imagine not eating for 3 years and the first thing you do is grab a Bible. And I think that he really did become much more devout through that experience, and I think his God was a big bridge to him getting through re-entry into what we would call a normal life.
Mm-hmm. And now maybe we can start to open it up to the both of you, and whoever wishes to jump in, perhaps. We explained before that the reference, to go back to the Japanese-Canadian experience, that the apology came much, much, much later, and our country continues to grapple with very dark chapters in its history, and I wonder if those any of those contexts, either directly or indirectly, may have influenced the writing of this book. Like, was that in your mind at the time? I mean, you were probably we were working through the Truth and Reconciliation discussions there, and
I think it's on my mind a lot more
now
than before. I think going into the book, I was wanting to really just elucidate Ralph's life, Mitsue's life, in particular those two individuals' lives, and it was interesting to me that it was always interesting to me how disinterested both Ralph and Mitsue respectively thought other people would be about their lives. You know, they couldn't sort of grasp that I was writing about their lives, and that folks would sort of take time out and really dig deep into it and think about it and spend time with them. But I think on my way out of the journey, I definitely think more about the power of those processes, which are simultaneously very personal and also very public. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a wonderful example of that, where you're kind of going band by band and, you know, person by person and heart by heart, but you're also, you know, at the macro level thinking about how do we as a country, whilst we're doing that sort of personal apology and you know, how do we ensure that at the government level we don't mess it up again or stop messing it up, or how do we use public policy to find avenues, off-ramps from this vicious cycle that we have found ourselves in.
Right. And I'm wondering, Stan, if we could bring you in here, what your perspective might be on persons who would be considering immigrating to Canada today. I mean, it's a distant ancestry that has brought you here to Medicine Hat, but certainly we're living in a place of significant immigration, and I'm wondering what.
I guess from
your
a
thoughts are.
from a perspective of immigration, Avril, you know, Canada, you know, we need immigration. You know, Canada is still a young country in the global scheme of things, and opportunity is available here in Canada. There's not a serious class structure here. Anyone can make a decent living here, you know, just through hard work and tenacity and opportunity. And as a Canadian citizen, I welcome immigration, because we need it. You know, we're at a baby boom generation that we are all soon to be retired. If not, we're retiring now, and we need to fill those ranks. And it's only going to come through immigration. So my only concern is, you know, every once in a while there is a little bit of Islamophobia going on right now. So if I ever hear it, I have to nip it in the bud and say, listen, you know, this is not right what you're thinking.
Yes, indeed. And I'm thankful for that type of outspokenness. Clearly you've inherited it, Mark, that it is time to speak truth. And some of those details of truth can be so intensely personal. So we're going to move to the last and final section of the book that details your parents' lives, their personal lives, the breakup of their marriage, your own experiences growing up with an alcoholic mother, and ultimately her succumbing to that addiction. Stan, had you known that Mark's book was going to be taking that direction in advance? And
no, not at all, Avril. You know, I knew, I was really happy that he was capturing my mother while she was still alive, and also with Ralph's story that that was really eye-opening. And I did get a draft that Mark had sent on a computer, and then all of a sudden I said, "Oh,
Oh.
this is about our life," and so it was a revelation. But I'm really proud that he dig deep, and it was cathartic for him also, and so I was proud of that. That it was a difficult time to write about, but I think there's a great benefit for doing that.
And I'm wondering, Mark, you chose to entitle that particular section "The Gift," and I'm wondering if and how and why you chose that specific way of going at what it is that your parents or your mother in particular may have given you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll answer that in two ways. The first is, because my dad is such a wonderful guy and so well known in the city, I think a lot of people will think, oh, it's such a great thing that, Mark and Daniel had Stan in their life because they've gone on and had interesting lives and they seem to be pretty decent humans. And that is 100% true. But I'm here as much as because of what Diane has given me than what Stan has given me. Even though my pop put his name up for public office even, I think my advocacy and why I'm interested in politics and public advocacy, I think I actually got more from my mom than my dad. So I think in many ways, I'm here in equal measures because of those two wonderful people and many others. Sue's my stepmom and my grandparents. So that's the one thing I'd say. And the second thing I'd say is, the gift was really, when you lose a parent through because of alcoholism, like it's insidious and it really bites you at the worst times. It bites you when you're the happiest. You're at your wedding and you're out, you're sitting at the head table and you find yourself looking for your mom. And for me, the most poignant was at the birth of my daughter Mia in Toronto, and she was C-section. She was breech, so Jade had to have a C-section, and it's an operation. It's a serious procedure. So in 1 minute, you're in a room with your wife and doctors and nurses, and then the operation's over and the patient, i.e. the mother, is wheeled out and she goes into post-op and everyone's gone and you've got this little baby and it's the happiest moment of your life and you're also angry. And you're angry because Diane's not there and she'd love this little human being and would have a lot to learn and gain from her being in her life. And that's really in a strange way, that's the gift, because that's when I really started to think, my heart is this little human's emotional home for the next little while, and I need to, there are some rooms that need to be cleaned out here. Like I can't, if I harbor this anger and resentment and guilt and the cornucopia of emotions that you have when you have a parent who's passed away with a mental illness or alcoholism, that's where I really started to look at how did my grandparents, who I knew had dark histories and significant trauma, how were their hearts cleaned out? How did they clean out their rooms in their heart? Because obviously they had anger, resentment, grief over what they had lost. So that's the gift is really me taking my own personal tragedy and using the gift that my grandparents gave me, which is just, their gift was how they lived their lives.
Indeed, yes, and I'm glad that, I'm personally exceptionally glad that part is part of your book. And I'm looking at the podcasts that exist now of the Canada Reads event, if we can move there, it's clear that resonated with Jeannie Becker, and that as herself the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, there's every need to try to come to grips with both the truth of all of the details of the tragedies, but also try, as you say, to clear and understand how one moves on. And and changes. And I'm just wondering what you heard from Jeannie Becker's defense of your book and what resonated most for you.
Yeah, coming to know Jeannie was really wonderful. She's a spitfire. She's a real dynamo, and she came into the experience with great trepidation. Actually, her background is in fashion television and music videos and fashion television. I think that, well, I don't think, she told me, and I'm not speaking out of turn, she'd say it if she was here. She really wanted to push herself and see if there was enough intellectual heft. She wanted to prove, to her own self, I think, that, she could be in front of a camera talking more about than the latest trends out of Milan or whatever the case may be. And but she really in her bones understood the themes, and I think she was just absolutely terrific. And I mean, obviously she convinced 4 other really strong-willed, intelligent people that Forgiveness should maybe be the book that was chosen that year.
Yeah, and I understand from you, Stan, that you were there in the audience in the final discussion, were you?
Yes, yeah. Susan and I, we arrived Tuesday night, and then there was taping on Wednesday and Thursday, and it was really nail-biting for us. It was so exciting.
I bet.
And we also, after each taping, we met the other advocates, and we had some really good conversations. And it was a really exciting time for us.
Yeah, so in our Medicine Hat newspaper, Mark, in the winning of Canada Reads, you are quoted as saying, "It was a lot more emotional than I thought it was going to be."
Yeah.
And are the emotions starting to die down now? Or maybe since you're settling into your new celebrity status? Or are you now on a new high?
Yeah, let's
given
not take it too
that we have the more recent announcement of the 4-part miniseries coming out of the CBC.
That's very that
Are
is
you at
really
liberty
wonderful.
to talk about that
sure,
a bit?
Yeah, sure, I can talk about it. I think that, but I think that from an emotional perspective, no, it doesn't die down. I don't think I really don't really want them to die down. I think I've always been pretty emotional when it comes to my grandparents in particular, my pop. So, I think that's just sort of a state of being. I think as I get older, I get tearier, for sure. I'm a bit of a crier now, and that's fine. I sort of think of it like, how you're not supposed to retain a sneeze, if you get a sneeze, you better sneeze, like get it out. I think it's the same about tears. So I'm cool with crying. I think in terms of the miniseries, CBC is really excited about it. Don Carmody is probably his generation's he's Canadian, but he's done a lot of Hollywood films. Probably the best producer in the country. He has done Good Will Hunting, Chicago the movie. Like, this guy is like top notch, top drawer, and he's really excited about. He and his partner David Cormacan are really excited about this, and they've done work with NHK, Japan's public broadcaster as well, so they might be involved. They're not involved yet, but there are conversations there, and Netflix is also talking as well. So it's all just very, very interesting and exciting, and I'm just spending my time with respect to Forgiveness, really working with Rob King, the scriptwriter, and Joy, and just trying to make sure that the script is as good as possible, putting our best foot forward. Although I'm not, like, it's their baby. I just sort of help out, and mostly I'm a cheerleader. They're really running with it, and that's awesome. It's awesome to see other artists sort of take your art and go their own way with it.
And it becomes something
something
different.
else. Yeah, exactly.
Something
And I'm
else.
totally cool with that. Like, that's great.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I just wonder if either of you, or you, Stan, have any thoughts on who you'd like to play you in that mini-series.
Gosh, Avril, that's a question out of the blue.
Brad Pitt.
Whoever they choose, I'll be happy with.
I'm sure you will. Yeah. So now, Mark, you've joined the likes of Michael Ondaatje, Miriam Toews, Lawrence Hill, among many other previous writers who have won Canada Reads. And how does it feel to stand with these great Canadian authors?
Yeah, that seems like that question is a setup. Oh, it's
sorry.
no, it's all
Sorry.
good. It's all good. Like it feels like, yeah. I mean, I don't even really. It's you can tell by my response. It's sort of just still shocking. Yeah, it's very humbling, and I mean that in the most sincere sense. It's you know, these are some of the finest artists in the country, and to have gone through the experience that they went through too, and have nail biting experiences, and to come out on the other end of it is really wonderful. But I do like the most important thing. Like, I'm not blind to the amplifying effect of Canada Reads. It sells, like, when you win, you sell more copies. It's big. It's the biggest award that you can win as a Canadian author in terms of sales. So I'm not blind to that at all. But I do think that, you know, what feels great from my perspective is, you know, so many folks, like when life threw me on the mat, you know, falling down, there's nothing interesting in falling down. Like, everyone's going to fall down. You're going to fall down. We're going to fall down. You're going to fall down behind the camera. Everybody is, you know. There's nothing interesting in that. It's really, what's interesting is getting up, and that's where the hero lies, is when you get up and dust yourself off and move on in a way that your heart isn't angered by falling down or held back by falling down. You're open to tomorrow, and you're open to compassion. And I had those two lighthouses when I had that path. Mm-hmm. Some people did light, you know, put a spotlight on the rocky water and made sure that I made my way inland, you know, and lots of people don't have that. So I hope that, you know, in these amplified sales, and people walking into public libraries or going into their high school or whatever the case may be, that for those folks that are on the mat that don't have a lighthouse in Mitsue or Ralph, they don't have the Ralphs in their life, that, you know, Mitsue and Ralph can help them. Yeah, so that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm just wondering, Stan, if you have some final thoughts too on ways you think that the message of your son's book can be relevant to Canadians today.
Well, you know, Avril, I think, you know, forgiveness is really a universal theme. And I think, you know, each and every one of us, you know, we have stories, mm-hmm. and our grandparents or great-grandparents have stories. And I'm just proud that Mark was able to take that time and write, you know, his story, because we all have stories. So I think we need to keep reading and writing.
Yeah, thank you. And I really want to thank the both of you for joining with me here today, and to thank the viewer certainly for listening in on Between the Lines of this remarkable book. It's been my distinct pleasure to be able to talk to you together, and I'm humbled by your experience, truly, and your candor, your willingness to speak openly for our viewers today. I'm reminding viewers, if you haven't had an opportunity to yet read Forgiveness, a gift from my grandparents, that it will be available in the Medicine Hat Public Library through the book club kits that are put together, so that you and your friends can get together with one another and discuss, just as I had a wonderful opportunity to do with my own book club when the book was longlisted for CBC Canada Reads. So I just want to conclude to the both of you, Mark and Stan, you know that from tragedy can come often greatness. And I really wish you and your families and the future generations of Sakamotos all the very best. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, viewers.